Hey people, I'm Sergio Parisi and you're watching Rugby Wrap-Up.
Coming up next on Rugby Wrap-Up, George Hook, Dan Lyle, and Matt McCarthy.
Johnny Wilkinson, he drops from Tonga has beaten France.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rugby Wrap-Up. Matt McCarthy in Midtown Manhattan talking rugby and talking Rugby World Cup rugby. And you need big names to talk about big tournaments, and we have just that today. We have Mr. George Hook calling in from Dublin, and Mr. Dan Lyle, the one and only Dan Lyle, calling in from somewhere in Connecticut. Let's welcome George first. George, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, and it's very special for me to be on a program with the greatest eagle of them all, Dan Lyle.
Well, you'll get no argument from Dan or me. Dan, the original Captain America, welcome, my friend.
The pleasure is all mine, man.
Oh, you look every bit as successful as an NBC analyst right now, my friend. I am so jealous of you. I want to hit you in the face with a bag of nickels.
Thank you.
All right, boys, let's get right to it. Let's get to the nitty-gritty. The World Cup is in full swing. George, let's start with you. What's something that you take away from this? Let's start with maybe poor performances for 300.
Well, I mean, for poor performances, I think are twofold. One, it's Scotland, who are simply awful. And I mean, all the pre-match hype by the coach, the captain, and the players, they were just horrible. And the second thing is, if the refereeing at this World Cup continues at the abysmal level it has started, then rugby's done. Rugby as we know it is done, because unless something really seriously now happens with the game we're refereeing, it's going to be meaningless. All I've seen at the moment, primarily, is appalling refereeing.
To that end, the South Africans have been crying that Jerome Garces is a duess. Dan, what is your take on the officiating thus far? Are they valid complaints?
They're valid complaints, but lo and behold, World Rugby actually admitted it and put out a statement saying that their standards have not been met in these first few games and that they were trying and working on rectifying that. Whether they can or they can't, but I think that's pretty honest to be able to do that, just this early and saying we've got to get better. So along with all the other poor performances, certainly from a Scotland perspective, you can't disagree with George there, although Ireland answered a lot of questions, maybe against a poor Scotland team, but answered a lot of questions. My big take, though, is no one ever heard of him. No one ever saw him. Zane Capelli, the Tongan number 7, stopping Billy Vunipola, the wrecking ball in his tracks in that game was just a sight to behold. So those are my takes.
Billy's dad played for Tonga, so maybe he gave his fellow Tongans some inside tips. But here's a quote from Rory Best: "Reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated." George, Mr. 80 minutes. And did Ireland just play really well, as Dan was alluding to?
About a week ago, everybody was saying, oh, listen, we're really worried about the Scottish game and we don't seem to be doing well, blah, blah, blah. And then we play against what may be the worst number 2 team in any pool in the competition. And suddenly we're going to win the World Cup. And we've gone from one extreme to the other. Now, we are not that good based on Scotland. So let's just hold it for a second. We're okay. We're better than I thought we were, but we're not world beaters. We're not capable of scoring tries from outside the 5-meter line.
Well, wait a minute. If your pack is scoring 3 tries and a bonus point win, that's a pretty good thing.
Sure, against Scotland, against Samoa, against Russia, fine. But I mean, South Africa aren't going to fall over for that kind of stuff. The All Blacks aren't going to fall over for that kind of stuff. Wales and England aren't going to fall over for that kind of stuff unless we get another game. But here's the issue: there are now only 2 teams in the World Cup playing rugby. Every other team in the World Cup is playing a game from the same playbook, which is 50% of the time the scrum half kicks the ball. If he doesn't kick it, he passes it to a forward who crashes into the nearest forward, which then goes on interminably. So our television producer says we are now at ruck number 99. So therefore, there is no longer what there once was. You had the South African way of playing the game. You had the New Zealand way of playing the game. You had the English way of playing the game. You don't only have one way of playing the game, which is kick it up in the air and run after it. And if that fails, crash, bang, wallop. And God help me, I am hoping that Wales and New Zealand will somehow change the face of rugby.
Oh boy, that was a mouthful. There's so much in there that this show doesn't have the format for me to address each one of those issues. But I'm going to turn it over to Dan. Dan, what has surprised you the most in this tournament? Has it been the fact that you've got Johnny Sexton not missing a beat really and making tackles, including tackling Conor Murray and Conway in the try zone after Conway scored the try? What surprises you here?
I don't think we've seen any surprises yet. I think that it's gone to form. There's been some first game jitters by the host, by Australia, and the other teams that should have won have won. The most compelling game was Argentina, France, the two Latins coming together and playing. I think you can only put what's in front of you, and I would say if you're Australia playing against the most competitive Fiji team we've ever seen, and kind of weathering that storm and that physicality coming out of the back end of that was, they were able to do that. Japan, they got a bonus point, they got a win, but they didn't really inspire their public. Although, the Ireland beating Scotland sets up that pool for that last match potentially for Japan to go to a quarterfinal in their in their home country, which would just be fantastic. So I think it's gone pretty to form, and just not to rebuff what George says, but maybe to as the eternal optimist that all Irish are, they needed to win, they needed to get a bonus point, they needed to see some execution out of their halfbacks, they needed to get their forwards back in the game, and they needed to see what the depth looked like with Kearney and Earls back out and having Lamar Jordan and Andrew Conway come in and have pretty decent games. You're only as good as who's in front of you, and so they pretty much kept Scotland off the park. We've almost got 2 pool winners out of the first round here of New Zealand beating South Africa, experimenting with Muanga and Bowden Barrett as these two playmakers, but they looked very skillful. They had their moments, and in South Africa, are really going to have to find a little bit more playmaking to unlock some of those lethal weapons, despite the big physicality, straight game that George is talking about.
Yeah, and for South African fans, aside from the refereeing, Pollard didn't step up. But again, you're playing against the All Blacks, arguably the best team in the tournament, so it's kind of understandable. I will say that Japan might have come out flat because they got stuck in traffic in their own country coming to the opening match of the tournament. You got to fix you got to get.
I saw an article about that that this World Cup is huge and fantastic, and it's the biggest thing for all of us in the rugby world, and it's on a new continent with a new 10 post. But next year is the Olympics, and they're testing out all the traffic patterns, and they didn't pass very well. Yeah, all the articles said. Yeah.
They get sent to the bin. George, is Vasily Artemyev the best Irish fullback in the tournament?
I think Russia were actually unlucky, like so many of the smaller nations. Smaller nations are screwed in this. The history of rugby has always been that the big guys screw the little guys. So Russia have to turn around, and I have no doubt that the difference between their second half performance and their first half performance was because of the short turnaround they had. I mean, Joe Smith is moaning and groaning that he's got a 6-day turnaround for Ireland. The Russians, I mean, I don't know how they did it. They had a great first half. Their naivety cost them when Samoa had only 13 players. But ultimately, in a country where humidity is a big deal, the sort of short turnarounds being given to the minor nations is unfair. But there's one very important thing here, is that America, like Ireland, is a country of laws. And if you don't have laws, ultimately you have nothing. And France perpetrated the greatest robbery since Jesse James and his gang when they stole it from Argentina by incompetent refereeing.
Yeah, I agree with you on some of the laws being skirted here, specifically the high tackles. I think clotheslines are accepted in this tournament. Dan, does that open the gate for the loose the flankers taking the heads off of the backs with this? It doesn't seem like there's a red card culpability, or there's no red card. There's no holding these guys accountable so far. Is it to get the tier 1 teams through?
Yeah, I certainly think there's some bias. There's always been that bias. To George's first point, Artemiev is got the best mustache of all time, so he might be the best fullback
and the greatest. One of the best post game chats.
Interviews.
Yeah,
wonderful.
It's that Black Rock College education.
When it comes to the laws of the game, I think that the challenge right now is that referees are scrutinized, that they want the ball in play more, and they are looking at player welfare all at the same time. And so they have a mixed message going back and forth to how the game should look and feel, with just huge amounts of disparity between what is and isn't a high tackle or a tendency in a tackle, and some of the things that are fundamental, the laws. Only the old Rugbyans, the 3 lawyers that came together that formed those, who were lawyers, made them laws, George, as we all know.
Yeah.
But those laws of offsides and others, the basics of the game, sometimes are being overlooked because they're all looking at those 2 aspects of play, of fast play and tackles and welfare, and it's really hard. So is it a second ref? Is it not putting as much pressure on these referees? And the best referees are like the best players. They're talking and seeing it and administrating the game. And it seems like they have more time. Those that don't, look flustered and not. So it's a challenge, and I'm just happy that at least they acknowledged it after the first few games.
Hey guys, we are out of time on this segment, but Dan, I want you to stick around with us if you can, with me and George. We're going to go over our picks in a different segment. So that'll be a different segment, folks. And on behalf of Mr. Dan Lyle and Mr. George Hook, I'm Matt McCarthy for Rugby Wrap Up, signing off.